Hey everyone. Tonight, we are going somewhere that no camera has ever filmed, no documentary has ever truly captured, and no history textbook has ever been quite honest enough to fully describe. Tonight, we are going back 10,000 years. And before we do, take a moment, if you feel like it, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if this kind of journey is something you genuinely look forward to. And drop a comment below, letting me know where you heard about this video. Was it a recommendation from a friend? An algorithm rabbit hole at 2 in the morning? A stranger on the internet with good taste? I always love knowing how you found your way here. Now, get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let me ask you something before we start, because the answer matters. When you picture life 10,000 years ago, what do you actually see? If you're honest, truly honest, you probably see something grim. Huddled figures around a smoky fire, teeth chattering, too frightened to wander far from whatever dark cave they call home. Short lives ending in infection, or violence, or starvation. Minds too simple to think past the next meal. Primitive people, barely people at all. That picture is wrong, not slightly wrong. Not wrong around the edges, fundamentally, deeply, fascinatingly wrong. But here is the thing that makes tonight's story genuinely strange. The conventional alternative. The idea that our prehistoric ancestors were perfectly noble, perfectly healthy, harmonious with nature, living in some kind of Edenic bliss. That picture is also wrong. The truth is more complicated than either version. And the truth is what I want to take you into tonight. Because what the archaeology actually shows, the bones, the teeth, the chemical signatures locked inside ancient skeletons, the stone structures built before a single farm existed, paints a picture of human life 10,000 years ago that will probably surprise you. And it has a thesis at its center that is genuinely unsettling once you follow it all the way through. Here it is, stated plainly. The invention of agriculture, the thing we have been taught to celebrate as humanity's great leap forward, may have initially made most people's lives measurably worse. Not better, worse. The first farmers were shorter, sicker, and in worse dental health than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. They had less food diversity, more epidemic disease, more hierarchical inequality, and skeletal evidence of greater nutritional stress. The revolution we call civilization came at a cost that was paid, in full, by the bodies of the first people who lived through it. And the people who came before them, the ones we so easily dismiss as primitive, were in several important physical and cognitive respects doing remarkably well. Let's go find them. There is a woman buried in the Levant whose bones have been telling a story for the past 12,000 years, and researchers finally learned to listen to it. She was found at a Natufian site, one of the late Stone Age cultures that flourished across what is now Israel, Jordan, and Syria in the millennia just before and around 10,000 BCE. She was probably in her 50s when she died, which was old for the time, genuinely old. A person who had accumulated a lifetime of experience in a world where most people didn't make it that far. Her teeth were worn, dramatically worn, ground nearly to the gum line by decades of eating coarse wild foods, seed-grinding stonework, and possibly the use of her teeth as a tool in ways that are still being studied. But her teeth had almost no cavities. The dental disease that plagues modern mouths was largely absent from hers. Her spine showed significant arthritis. Her hips showed the bone remodeling that comes from a life of sustained physical activity, squatting, climbing, carrying loads across uneven terrain. She had heel fractures in her left forearm, probably from a fall taken years before her death. Set imperfectly, but healed well enough to function. She had survived it. Someone had helped her through it. That last detail matters. A fracture like hers, in the acute phase, would have been painful and debilitating. She could not have gathered her own food during the healing weeks. She would have needed water brought to her, food brought to her, protection. Someone did that. Someone chose to invest the time and energy and resources to keep this woman alive through an injury that could have been a death sentence. We don't know her name, obviously. We don't know who kept her alive, or whether they were a child she had raised, a friend from decades of shared work, a sibling, or a partner. We only know that she was kept alive, and that she then lived long enough to become the kind of person who, in a world without writing, was the most precious thing a community could have, a repository of accumulated knowledge. Someone who remembered the drought that came 2 generations back and knew which roots survived it. Someone who knew the paths and the seasons and the stories. Archaeologists found her buried with deliberate care, not just placed in the ground, arranged, flowers possibly, based on pollen analysis near the burial. Her position suggesting intention, thought, something beyond the merely practical. Someone had mourned her. I think about her sometimes when I read the statistics about Mesolithic health. The statistics are real and important. The bone density measures, the caries rates, the stature data. But behind every number is a person who got up in the morning and moved through a world as real as ours. A person who knew things we no longer know and worried about things we've long since solved, and loved people and lost them and kept going. She is the human face behind tonight's story. Hold her in mind as we go further. Paul, let's start with the world itself. Not the world as we know it, but the world as it actually was 10,000 years ago. Because the landscape was not the same. The last great ice age had peaked around 20,000 years ago, and by 10,000 BCE, the ice had been retreating for a full 10,000 years, but the transformation was still unfolding. Coastlines were changing. Forests were expanding across landscapes that had been open tundra for millennia. The great rivers of Eurasia ran higher and colder. The climate was warming, rapidly by geological standards, gradually enough to be nearly imperceptible in a human lifetime. And the animals were disappearing. This is one of the most uncomfortable facts in the story of our deep past, and it is almost never mentioned in the romantic versions. The people living 10,000 years ago were participants in one of the largest extinction events in Earth's recent biological history. The woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant ground sloth, the cave lion, the short-faced bear, the horse of the Americas, the giant kangaroo of Australia. All of these animals and dozens of others vanished from the earth within a few thousand years of sustained contact with human hunters. Africa, which had evolved alongside human hunters for hundreds of thousands of years, kept most of its large fauna. The great elephants, the lions, the hippos. They had time to learn to fear us. Everywhere else, the large animals encountered skilled human hunters for the first time and had no inherited wariness, no evolved behavioral response to the most efficient predator the world had ever produced. They were, to put it plainly, easy, and humans, doing what successful hunters do, took them. The people hunting these animals 10,000 years ago were not villains. They had no way of knowing, any more than we have a clear emotional sense of the long-term effects of our own carbon emissions, that the cumulative weight of generations of successful hunting would remove these animals from the world permanently. But by 10,000 BCE, the megafaunal extinctions were largely complete in most of the world, and the ecological consequences were reshaping everything. The loss of large grazers changed vegetation patterns. The loss of certain predators cascaded through food webs. The human hunters who had built their cultures around pursuit of the great beasts had to adapt to a world of smaller, faster, more behaviorally sophisticated prey. The red deer, the wild boar, the aurochs, the ibex, their tools changed. Their hunting strategies changed. The Mesolithic toolkit, those elegant, modular microlithic blades, was in part an adaptive response to hunting animals that required different techniques than mammoths. And simultaneously, the sea was rising. The coastlines of the world were moving inland, swallowing the landscapes where some of the densest and most settled populations of hunter-gatherers had ever lived. We know almost nothing about these coastal peoples, because their sites are now submerged under tens of meters of ocean. The rare glimpses archaeologists have had through underwater excavations in the Baltic, the North Sea, the continental shelves around the world suggest communities that were resource-rich, relatively settled, probably larger than the nomadic inland bands of popular imagination. An entire chapter of human prehistory is sitting underwater. When we say we don't know what life was really like 10,000 years ago, part of what we mean is that the best preserved evidence may be at the bottom of the sea. Point. The world was not empty. This needs to be stated directly, because the implicit picture that most people carry of prehistoric humanity, isolated, frightened, scattered, is archaeologically indefensible. Hunter-gatherer societies across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas were networked. Obsidian, the volcanic glass used for making the sharpest possible cutting tools, appears at Mesolithic sites hundreds of miles from the nearest source. Shell ornaments from Mediterranean coastlines appear in burials far inland. Red ochre, used for body decoration and pigment, was traded across distances that would take weeks to cross on foot. These are not accidents of geology. They are the traces of sustained, deliberate exchange networks, the kind that require trust, established relationships, shared conventions about value and reciprocity, and the repeated, effortful work of keeping alliances alive across distance and time. You do not trade obsidian across 400 miles by luck. You do it because generations of people on both ends of that chain have invested in the relationship. What this means is that a person living 10,000 years ago almost certainly knew people, or knew of people who knew people, spanning an enormous geographic range. News traveled, ideas traveled, a new technique for hafting a blade, a better method for preparing certain plant foods, a more effective way to waterproof leather. These moved across the landscape through human contact, faster than we once assumed. The Clovis culture of North America shows a remarkable consistency of tool design across thousands of miles of continent, from what is now Montana to what is now Texas. That is not genetic uniformity. It is cultural connection. It is the signature of people in sustained communication with one another. And then there is Göbekli Tepe. If there is one place that should permanently retire every remaining condescending thought about prehistoric people, it is a hillside in what is now southeastern Turkey, a site called Göbekli Tepe, which in Turkish means roughly pot-bellied hill. Discovered in the 1990s by archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, it is one of the most genuinely disorienting facts in all of human history. Göbekli Tepe contains massive limestone pillars, some of them over 18 feet tall, some weighing more than 10 tons, carved with extraordinary precision into T-shapes and decorated with detailed, skilled reliefs of animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, gazelles, wild boars, ducks. The carvings are not rough, they are accomplished. They show mastery of representation, a confident artistic vocabulary, a consistency of style across what appear to be generations of construction. The site was built approximately 11,600 years ago. The radiocarbon dates have been checked and rechecked and confirmed across multiple laboratories. And here is why those dates matter. They place the construction of Göbekli Tepe firmly, unambiguously, before agriculture existed in the region. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. Analysis of the thousands of animal bones found at the site shows wild gazelle, wild aurochs, wild boar, hunted animals, not farmed ones. The plant remains show wild cereals, not domesticated crops. The builders were fed by the land as it naturally existed, and yet they organized themselves to quarry limestone blocks weighing several tons, transport them uphill from quarries several hundred meters away, shape them with precision tools made of flint, erect them in deliberate configurations that appear to incorporate astronomical alignments, and decorate them with carving that represents sustained artistic labor over years. Scholars refer to Göbekli Tepe as a special purpose site, a place people came to from across a wide region, probably seasonally, for communal ceremony and feasting, rather than permanent habitation. The quantities of animal bones suggest enormous meals were shared here. The structure suggests repeated construction and modification over centuries. This was not a one-time gathering. This was an institution. Klaus Schmidt spent the last years of his life at this site, and his conclusion became one of archaeology's most quoted lines. First the temple, then the city. What he meant was that the conventional sequence, people settle, develop agriculture, accumulate surplus, then have enough time and social organization to build monuments, appears at Göbekli Tepe to run precisely backwards. The monument came first. The communal ritual came first. The reaching towards something beyond the practical came first. Whether you fully accept Schmidt's interpretation or prefer the more cautious reading proposed by some of his colleagues, that Göbekli Tepe may have been a cultural anchor for hunter-gatherer communities resisting the pull towards sedentism. The core fact remains staggering. 11,600 years ago, before a single farm existed in the region, people who lived by hunting and gathering built something that has outlasted every king, every empire, every civilization that came after them. They were not waiting for history to begin. They were already inside it. Paul. Now let's talk about the bodies, what the skeletons actually say, because this is where the conventional story of human progress hits a wall. Start with teeth, because teeth preserve extraordinarily well and tell an extraordinarily clear story. The teeth of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people living in the era around 10,000 BCE, tend to show very low rates of dental cavities. Studies of Natufian skeletal remains from the same culture as the woman I described earlier show carries rates of around 6 to 7% across examined populations. That is comparable to modern populations practicing good dental hygiene with limited sugar intake. The teeth are worn, dramatically, sometimes shockingly worn. A lifetime of eating coarse, gritty foods, wild grains full of mineral dust from the grinding stones used to process them, dried meat that pulled and tore, fibrous roots and tubers, meant that many Mesolithic adults who lived into middle age had teeth worn nearly to the gum line. But the bacterial rot, the cavities, the abscesses and tooth loss from decay that plagued modern mouths, those are largely absent. Then agriculture arrived, and the mouths changed. When populations began eating diets dominated by domesticated grains, softer in texture, higher in fermentable carbohydrates, the bacterial ecosystem of the mouth shifted. The Streptococcus mutans bacteria that drives most dental decay flourished in the new dietary environment. Cavity rates climbed steeply. Early Neolithic skeletal assemblages showed dramatically higher rates of tooth decay and periodontal disease compared to Mesolithic populations in the same regions. Think about that for a moment. We did not develop dental disease because we got lazy about brushing. We developed it because we changed what we ate. And what we changed to, the carbohydrate-dense diets of early farming, was in this particular dimension worse for us than what we had been eating before. The story of stature is similar and equally striking. Average height for Mesolithic European men has been estimated through skeletal analysis at around 178 centimeters, close to 5 feet 10 inches. Mesolithic European women averaged around 168 centimeters. These were not short people. After the adoption of agriculture, average stature fell significantly. Early Neolithic European men averaged closer to 165 centimeters. Women dropped to roughly 155. Humans got smaller as they started farming, and they did not recover to pre-agricultural stature levels in Europe until roughly the 20th century of the Common Era. Height is a sensitive indicator of nutritional adequacy during childhood growth. When children eat poorly, not necessarily in terms of calories, but in terms of protein quality, dietary diversity, and micronutrient availability, they grow shorter. The stature decline visible in the archaeological record is the skeletal signature of nutritional stress experienced across generations. Early farming populations were, on average, nutritionally worse off than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. Add to this the evidence from bone density. Hunter-gatherers tended to have dense, strong bones, the result of lifetimes of loading activity, walking long distances, carrying, climbing, using the body in ways that continuously strengthen the skeleton. Some analyses of Mesolithic skeletal remains have found bone density levels that would be notable by any standard. reflecting bodies built by real physical work across entire lifetimes. The study that perhaps most clearly crystallized all of this evidence was published in the mid-1980s by researchers Mark Cohen and George Armelagos. They examined skeletal assemblages from populations around the world, comparing health indicators before and after the adoption of agriculture. Their conclusion: in 19 out of 21 societies studied, health declined measurably when populations transitioned to farming. 19 out of 21. This finding has been debated, refined, and contextualized in the decades since. Some researchers emphasize that the picture varied significantly by region and by specific agricultural system. Some point out that the same Neolithic transition that reduced average health-enabled population growth, that hunter-gatherer modes of living could never have sustained. These are legitimate nuances, but the core pattern has held up across subsequent research with remarkable consistency. For the individuals who lived through the agricultural transition, the evidence from their own bodies suggests it was not an obvious improvement. Paul. There is another skeleton I want to tell you about. A different person, a different moment. He was found at a site in what is now Romania, dated to the Mesolithic period. He had been, by the time of his death, significantly disabled. His left leg showed evidence of an old injury, probably a severe compound fracture. That had healed, but healed badly, leaving him with a leg that would have been permanently shorter and weaker than the other, almost certainly causing a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. Analysis of his spine and other joints shows the compensatory patterns of someone who had been managing this asymmetry for years. Here is the remarkable part. The injury had healed years before his death. He had lived with this disability. Significant disability in a world that required sustained physical capability to subsist for a substantial period. And during that time, someone fed him. Someone brought him water. Someone made it possible for him to survive a healing process that would have left him completely unable to care for himself for weeks, and then only partially capable for months or years. In a world where the margins were narrow and everyone's contribution to the group's survival mattered, this man was kept alive through a period where he could contribute very little. He was kept alive because someone chose to keep him alive. The skeletal record is full of these stories if you know what to look for. A Mesolithic woman in what is now Germany, whose bones show she was born with a congenital hip condition that would have made walking painful and difficult from her earliest years, and who lived into her 30s or 40s. An elderly individual at a Natufian site, whose advanced bone loss from osteoporosis indicates he or she was so debilitated in the final years of life that basic movement would have been extremely difficult, and who was still alive, still fed, still there. A teenager at a Portuguese shell midden site whose bones show a severe systemic illness in childhood survived, leaving permanent marks on the skeleton, but survived. These people were not accidents of natural selection. They were deliberate investments by their communities. They were people someone decided were worth keeping alive, worth the caloric and social cost of care, worth the effort of protection. We tend to think of compassion, of care for the vulnerable, as a product of civilization, of settled communities, surplus food, specialized roles that allow some people to become carers, while others produce food. The Mesolithic evidence suggests this is wrong. The impulse to care for those who cannot fully care for themselves appears to be much older than farming, much older than cities, much older than anything we typically call civilized. It appears to be something close to bedrock in our nature as a social species. That, too, is a fact about 10,000 years ago. Not just the violence and the hardship, though those were real, but the sustained, deliberate, costly choice to take care of each other. Boom. Let's be honest about the hardship, because nothing in this story serves us if we slide into romantic mythology. Life was genuinely difficult, not in the abstract, not as a statistical average, but in the immediate, physical, daily reality of individual bodies trying to survive in an unforgiving world. Infant and child mortality was devastating. Archaeological demography, the study of age at death distributions in ancient populations, suggests that roughly a third of all births in Mesolithic populations ended before age 5. 1 in 3. Think about what that number means in human terms, in terms of grief and loss repeated across every generation, in terms of the weight that every parent in that world carried. The skulls of children are among the most common finds in Mesolithic burial sites. They were mourned, the elaborate care visible in some of these small burials, the ochre, the ornaments, the deliberate positioning makes clear that these deaths were felt as losses, not simply absorbed as statistical inevitabilities. Infection was a constant threat, and without antibiotics, it killed regularly and without mercy. A tooth abscess, the kind of thing that today sends you to a dentist and costs you an afternoon, could in the Mesolithic kill you within days as the infection spread to your jaw, your skull, your bloodstream. The skeletal evidence for fatal dental abscesses in prehistoric populations is extensive. People died of bad teeth. Not bad teeth from inadequate brushing, but bad teeth from the brutal physics of a lifetime of chewing coarse food, cracking nuts, using teeth as tools in ways our ancestors could not entirely avoid. A cut that got infected. In a world before any understanding of bacterial contamination, in a world where wounds were treated with clay and plant materials, and ritual could kill. A compound fracture, if it didn't heal cleanly, could become gangrenous. Childbirth, in a world without any of the interventions that now make it relatively safe, killed women with chilling regularity. The evidence for this is in the skeletal record. Many female deaths clustered in the reproductive years in ways that strongly suggest obstetric causes. In hunger, not starvation as a constant state. The evidence suggests that well-adapted Mesolithic populations generally had adequate caloric intake across most of the year. But hunger, as a seasonal reality, particularly in the late winter months before the spring abundance returned. Enamel hypoplasia, disruptions in tooth enamel that form during periods of nutritional stress in childhood, appears in Mesolithic teeth at rates that tell us children experienced episodes of real scarcity. The lean months were real. The gnawing cold of late February, when the stored food was running low and the game was still scarce, was real. The violence question is complicated and contested, and I want to be careful not to overstate it in either direction. Some Mesolithic sites show clear evidence of interpersonal violence, healed peri-fractures on forearms, embedded projectile points in bone, cranial trauma consistent with deliberate blows. Group violence, when it occurred, could be severe. The evidence from later prehistoric sites like Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota, dating to several thousand years after our main window, but still prehistoric, shows violence on a scale that is genuinely difficult to look at. Hundreds of individuals showing evidence of massacre and mutilation. But many Mesolithic burial sites show no violence at all. And the same cultures that produced evidence of occasional deadly conflict also produced the careful burials, the compassionate care of the injured, the grave goods that speak of grief and memory, and the belief that something of the person persisted beyond the body. The world of 10,000 years ago was not uniformly violent. It was variable, as human life has always been, capable of terrible cruelty and remarkable tenderness, often from the same people in the same community. Poll. What did people eat? And does the famous paleo diet bear any resemblance to what they actually put in their mouths? The honest answer is, partly, but the part that gets omitted is significant. Stable carbon isotope analysis, a technique that reads the chemical signatures preserved in ancient bone collagen, allows researchers to reconstruct the broad outlines of prehistoric diets with genuine precision. The carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone reflect the isotopic signatures of the foods consumed over years of life, and those signatures vary systematically between different food types. High trophic level nitrogen values indicate heavy animal protein consumption. Carbon ratios help distinguish between different categories of plant foods and marine versus terrestrial resources. When researchers run these analyses on Mesolithic skeletal remains, the picture is almost never one of pure carnivory. Hunter-gatherer diets were, in essentially every population studied, mixed. They included significant plant foods, alongside animal proteins, roots and tubers, wild seeds and grains, fruits and berries, nuts and legumes, fungi, and in coastal populations, the extraordinary caloric density of shellfish beds and fish runs. The proportion varied enormously. Arctic coastal populations show isotopic signatures indicating very heavy marine and land animal consumption, with minimal plant foods, because minimal plant foods were available. Tropical forest populations show abundant plant food consumption. Temperate Mesolithic Europeans show varied signatures that shift seasonally, reflecting the fundamental reality of eating what the landscape provided in whatever season it was. And that seasonal reality is what the modern paleo narrative systematically erases. Late winter was frequently a period of genuine caloric stress. The isotopic evidence shows it. The enamel hypoplasia shows it. The oral traditions of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, the few remaining, speak of hungry seasons as a simply factual feature of their calendar. Not a crisis, but a regular condition requiring preparation and management. People ate what was available. That included insects in seasons when they were plentiful, shellfish gathered from tidal zones, bark prepared in specific ways to extract nutritional value, river fish smoked or dried against lean months. The dietary breadth of Mesolithic populations was, if anything, greater than that of early farmers. And that breadth was probably one of the key health advantages that kept them, on average, nutritionally better off than the people who replaced them. Paul. Now let's talk about minds, because this is the question that lies at the center of all of it, and it is the question people are most hesitant to ask directly. What were the minds of people 10,000 years ago actually like? The answer, based on everything we know about human evolutionary biology and the archaeological record, is clear. They were our minds, identical in capacity. The modern human brain, with its capacity for language, abstract reasoning, social cognition, artistic expression, forward planning, and the rich inner life of imagination and self-reflection, emerged at least 300,000 years ago. There is no meaningful neurological difference between the person who carved the vultures at Göbekli Tepe and the person reading this transcript. None. The hardware is exactly the same. What has changed in the last 10,000 years is not brain capacity. It is accumulated cultural knowledge, the slow compounding of technology, writing, institutional memory, and shared information infrastructure that allows any single person today to draw on the cognitive work of billions of humans across millennia. We are not smarter than our ancestors. We are standing on a taller pile of their work. The evidence for the full range of human mental life in the deep past is everywhere once you know to look for it. Cave art was being created by anatomically modern humans at least 40,000 years ago. The paintings in Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain are not primitive attempts at representation. They are technically sophisticated, stylistically assured, and in some cases show a mastery of depicting movement and three-dimensionality on a flat surface that any art historian would recognize as genuine skill. The artists who made them were not practicing. They were performing at an advanced level, and some cave art, paintings and sites in Spain that have been dated to at least 65,000 years ago, may predate anatomically modern humans in Europe entirely, suggesting Neanderthals were creating symbolic imagery tens of thousands of years before our own ancestors arrived. Bone flutes, instruments that require precision manufacturing to produce specific tonal intervals, appear in the archaeological record of Europe 40,000 years ago. These are not noisemakers. They are musical instruments, carefully engineered to produce certain sounds, implying a musical tradition sophisticated enough to justify the labor of their creation. Language left no direct physical trace, but the behavioral complexity visible in the archaeological record, the long-distance trade networks, the organized collective labor of monument building, the multi-step production sequences required for sophisticated Mesolithic toolkits, the symbolic art, all of this is only possible with language of considerable richness. You cannot maintain alliance networks spanning hundreds of miles without sophisticated verbal conventions for conveying information, relationships, history, and expectation. You cannot transmit the ecological knowledge required to survive across dozens of plant and animal species without detailed, precise language for describing and categorizing the natural world. And if there was language, there was storytelling, the specifically human thing we do, making sense of experience by narrating it, finding the thread that connects what happened to what it means. Sitting around the fire 10,000 years ago, people told stories. We can be essentially certain of this. And those stories were not simply practical inventories of resource locations. They were, as all human stories are, attempts to make meaning out of being alive, attempts to answer the questions that have no clean answers. Why does the world work the way it does? What do we owe each other? Where do we go when we die? The people of 10,000 years ago were asking all of these questions. We just don't have their answers written down. Cool. Let's slow down for a moment and think about what a day actually looked like. Not in statistics, but in texture. What the morning smelled like. What the afternoon required. The hunter-gatherer day began with light, or with cold, or with the sounds of children waking. There was no clock, no schedule. But there was always a kind of immediate negotiation with the world, reading the weather, assessing what was available, deciding where to direct the group's energy. The elderly person in the group, often the most important voice in these daily decisions, carried something that no tool or weapon could replicate, the memory of how things had gone before. Which spring was like this one? Which migration pattern this weather tended to predict? Where the roots were thick in a year that looked like this one. Old people in the Mesolithic were not burdens. They were libraries. The making of tools was skilled, time-intensive work. Knapping flint, striking it with precisely calibrated force at precisely calculated angles to produce blades of specific shape and sharpness takes years to learn and a lifetime to master. Experimental archaeologists who have tried to replicate Mesolithic toolkits consistently find that achieving the level of precision visible in the archaeological record requires extended practice that can only be transmitted through direct apprenticeship. Tool-making knowledge was actively maintained and passed across generations. Another form of the accumulated cultural capital that made these societies far more sophisticated than their material remains alone might suggest. The picture of cognition comes into sharper focus when you think carefully about what environmental navigation and ecological knowledge actually required. A Mesolithic hunter operating in a dense European forest did not have GPS, did not have maps. What they had was an internalized spatial model of their territory, a mental geography built over years of ranging, refined by the accumulated observations of parents and grandparents and others who had traveled the same land before them. They knew which direction water lay from any given landmark. They knew which tree species indicated the presence of underground water. They knew the seasonal patterns of game, which routes animals used in spring versus autumn, where the good fishing was before and after the rains. They knew the look of sky that preceded bad weather, and the particular quality of wind that meant a storm before nightfall. This knowledge is not simple. It is not instinct. It is the product of sustained attention, careful observation, and the integration of enormous amounts of sensory information into coherent and actionable mental models. Cognitive scientists who study spatial navigation and ecological knowledge in traditional societies consistently describe these abilities as representing sophisticated cognitive performance, not primitive cognition, but advanced cognition deployed in domains that modern urban life rarely demands. The social cognition required to navigate a small group world was equally demanding. When every relationship matters, when the consequences of social miscalculation can be severe, when alliance maintenance across a wide network determines whether your group will receive help in a bad year or be left to starve. Reading intentions, tracking reputations, managing conflict, maintaining reciprocal obligations, knowing who can be trusted and at what level. All of this requires a quality of social intelligence that is cognitively substantial. The intelligence required was the same intelligence we have. It was simply pointed at different problems. Now, the shift. And it is worth taking slowly, because most of us were not told the full version. Around 10,000 BCE, in the region encompassing what is now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Jordan, the area archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, people began cultivating plants and managing animals in new ways, selecting for the characteristics they found most useful, planting near settlements rather than harvesting at random, keeping animals penned rather than hunting them wherever they were encountered. This process, gradual, multi-generational, uncertain, is what we call the Neolithic Revolution, and textbooks tend to present it as an obvious upgrade. As the moment humanity got smart enough to take control of its food supply and began its march toward civilization, the bodies of the first farmers tell a different story. We have already looked at the teeth getting worse and the stature declining, but the picture extends further. Infectious disease flourished in agricultural communities in ways it had not among mobile hunter-gatherers. When people settle permanently near their own waste, near their domesticated animals, and in communities dense enough to sustain epidemic transmission, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, measles, the ancient ancestors of these modern killers, the disease environment changes dramatically. A nomadic band of 20 people cannot sustain epidemic disease. The pathogens exhaust their hosts before they can find new ones. A village of several hundred, permanently settled, in contact with their own fecal material and the waste of their pigs and cattle, is a different matter entirely. He site of Çatalhöyük, one of the world's best-studied early agricultural settlements in what is now south-central Turkey, dating from around 7,500 BCE, shows this vividly. The site was densely packed, houses sharing walls, people entering through holes in the roofs rather than ground-level doorways. The rubbish middens were large and located close to living areas. Analysis of preserved organic material from the site shows high loads of intestinal parasites in the population. Analysis of the children's skeletons shows elevated rates of enamel hypoplasia, the signature of nutritional stress during tooth development. These were not comfortable people enjoying an agricultural paradise. These were people navigating a new and difficult environment, created by their own innovative choices, dealing with consequences they had no framework to anticipate. Inequality was another consequence that the bones record clearly. Hunter-gatherer bands tended toward what anthropologists call fierce egalitarianism, a pattern of social dynamics that strongly discouraged the accumulation of personal wealth, enforced through gossip, mockery, ostracism, and direct redistribution pressure. You cannot carry everything you own across a landscape, so ownership is naturally limited, and the social mechanisms of nomadic life evolved to prevent any individual from accumulating too much status or resources at others' expense. Agriculture created the material conditions for hierarchy. Storable surpluses, grain in a granary, livestock in a pen, could be accumulated and defended. Within a few thousand years of the transition in the Near East, the archaeological record shows clear evidence of stratification. Elite burials with elaborate grave goods versus commoner burials with nothing. Large structures that appear to be administrative or elite residential buildings versus the cramped dwellings of ordinary households. The people at the top of these emerging hierarchies were often those who controlled access to stored food, who, in a bad year when the harvest failed, held the power of life and death over those who hadn't saved enough. That power, once established, was not easily given up. None of this means agriculture was a mistake. Without it, the population levels that support everything we call civilization are impossible. The medicine, the science, the accumulated cultural complexity of the modern world is built on the agricultural foundation. But the transition was not, for the individuals who lived through it, a straightforward improvement. It was a trade with winners and losers, and in the early centuries of the agricultural transition, the losers were the people whose bodies were shorter, sicker, and more nutritionally stressed than the hunter-gatherers who had preceded them. Pong. Let's come back to Göbekli Tepe one more time, because there is something in it that the rest of the culture has not yet fully absorbed. The people who built those massive stone pillars were hunter-gatherers. Before agriculture, before writing, before any of the things we associate with complex civilization. It means that organized, collective, sustained, purposeful human enterprise. Quarrying stone, transporting it miles, shaping it with precision tools, erecting it in deliberate configurations, returning over what appears to be multiple centuries of construction, does not require farming, does not require writing. It does not require any of the things we have been taught to think of as prerequisites for civilization. The people who did this were fed by wild animals and gathered plants. They organized themselves through social bonds and cultural traditions, rather than through institutional bureaucracies. They operated on a knowledge base transmitted entirely through oral tradition and direct apprenticeship. And they built something that has outlasted every king and every empire that came after them. What was it for? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. The evidence points toward ritual, toward a place where groups gathered from across a wide territory to participate in communal feasting, communal ceremony, communal meaning-making. The quantities of animal bones suggest enormous shared meals. The carvings suggest a symbolic vocabulary being expressed across the pillars, a visual language of cosmological significance we cannot yet fully read. Klaus Schmidt believed this site was evidence that the human need for the sacred, for a place set apart for ritual that transcends practical function, was not a product of civilization. It was a precondition of it. The monument preceded the city. The ceremony preceded the harvest. The spiritual impulse came first. Göbekli Tepe stands as permanent evidence that the interior life of prehistoric humanity was not empty, not simple, not waiting to be filled by agriculture and writing before it became genuinely human. It was already 11,600 years ago, reaching towards something beyond survival, toward meaning, toward the sacred, towards something that would still be standing long after the builders themselves had become dust in deep memory. Paul, there is one more thing worth saying, and it might be the most important thing of all. The world of 10,000 years ago, for all its real hardships, the infant deaths, the infected wounds, the hungry late winters, the pain of broken bones healing imperfectly in the cold, was a world in which the fit between human beings and their environment was extraordinarily close. Not perfect, not painless, but close. These people knew their world in ways we have genuinely lost. They knew which plants were edible and which were toxic, not from a book, but from a tradition of lived knowledge, so old it was indistinguishable from instinct. They knew the behavioral patterns of animals well enough to anticipate them. They read weather, water, soil, sky, and wind in ways that constituted a real science, systematic, empirical, tested against experience, just without laboratories or journals. Their social lives were intense and immediate in ways that ours, mediated by screens and institutions and the enormous machinery of modern society, often are not. The band you belonged to was your world. The people in it were the most consequential facts of your existence. You knew everyone who depended on you, and everyone on whom you depended. You could see their faces. You knew their histories. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups consistently find that subsistence activities consume somewhere between 3 and 5 hours per day, on average, leaving the remainder for rest, social interaction, play, ceremony, and the reflective, creative, narrative life that is distinctly human. The image of the prehistoric person as a creature in constant, frantic struggle against nature is not what the ethnographic record shows. What it shows is a people with time, not leisure in the modern sense, but unstructured time in a natural world, with people they loved, in the kind of intimate social context that human beings evolved to inhabit. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. 10,000 years ago, you were already human. Fully, completely, recognizably human, with the same needs and fears and loves and questions that you carry right now. The context was different. The tools were different. The risks were different. But the person inside all of that, the one lying awake listening to the fire, feeling the weight of the people they loved and the fear of losing them, wondering what the darkness outside the firelight contained. That person would know you immediately, and you would know them. 10,000 years ago, someone lay awake beside a dying fire. The embers were going low. The night was cold. Around them, the people they loved were sleeping, breathing slowly, wrapped in hides, their faces softened by rest in ways they never quite were during the day. The stars above were impossibly thick. The wind moved through the grass in the valley below, the same grass where the gazelles had come to drink that evening, where tomorrow's food might be waiting. They were afraid of the darkness, of the winter, of the grinding uncertainty, of a world without guarantees. And they were grateful for the warmth still coming from the calls, for the sleeping children, for the fact that today had been enough. They wondered, in whatever words their language gave them, what tomorrow would bring. They wondered, somewhere in the quiet interior life that the brain gives to all of us, what it all meant, why they were here, what they owed the people sleeping beside them, what happened when the fire went out for the last time, across 10,000 years, across everything that has been built and destroyed and rebuilt in the long interval between that night and this one. Those questions have not changed. We are still asking them. We are asking them right now, in the quiet before sleep, in the way that every human being who has ever lived has asked them. In that, across every difference of tool and language and circumstance and century, we are not strangers to each other. We never were. Paul, if tonight's journey left you thinking a little differently about who we are and where we came from, I'd love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Or drop a line about where you first heard about this channel. And if this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling through history is something you want more of, a like and a subscription means this work can keep going. It genuinely makes a difference. Sleep well. The world is older, stranger, and more full of people than it sometimes seems. And every one of them, all the way back to the beginning, was trying, imperfectly, bravely in the dark, to figure out the same things you are. Good night.